While swimming through the unmedicated ADHD purgatory that was studying for my history exam back in 2020, I was knocked into a 4-year daze by some queer history from the 1600s of Denmark that has never been reported on before. While I could be a secretive little mysterious gremlin and wait until a bachelor or a master's degree, I'm very bad at keeping things inside. I'm leaking-pilled. I'm a truth maxer. Let's talk about the biggest traitor in Danish history and her relationships to women. Unless you're from a hyper-specific age range in the Danish population, you probably have no idea who the fuck this is. But that's why I'm here, to squeeze some sort of meaningful content out of the 4 years of being academically edged by so many scholars in the field. Before we get to what is probably going to be the most important research that I'll ever do in, if I was pretentious, would call my academic career, we need some context. This is the story of Leonora Christina Ulfeldt, which is very long and hard to pronounce. And while I do like things that are long and hard, in this version of the video, I will just be referring to her as Leo. Let's go in to her timeline. Oh, I'm getting... No. Do not get primer in the eye. That is disastrous. It's so hard being a femboy sometimes. All the primer I get in my eyes, I mean, it's not the fun kind of white liquid to go in my eyes. So 9 years before Leo's birth in 1612, Queen Anna of Denmark dropped off. She passed away, leaving King Christian IV, which is kind of the most well-known king in Danish history, without a queen. This would have been fine had he found some noblewoman on Renaissance Craigslist to marry him and take the place as queen. But that didn't happen. In 1615, he fell in love with this wild Norwegian, Kirsten Munk, who would eventually become Leo's mother. Munk wasn't really into him, but it turned out that Christian loved a good mix of toxic love and cuckoldry. So they made it work. Munk still refused to become queen, so any children who were so unlucky to be born from this train wreck of a marriage would be considered bastards, unable to inherit the throne. So that's a problem. One of these children is our protagonist, Leo, who was born in 1621. Doomed by the narrative as a bastard, things were looking pretty rough. However, as she grew up, she allegedly became Christian IV's favorite daughter. Historians disagree that this was the case, but for our purposes, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so that's eyeshadow. 19, no, not 19. I keep saying 19, it's like, no, it's like way older. In 1629, Christian IV hired the guy who would, in the future, become Leo's partner in crime, Corfitz, as the Chamberlain of the Court. This is the best translation I can find for that. The Danish word is kammerjunk. The following year, when Leo was, mind you, 9 years old, let me just repeat that, 9 years old, not even 10 yet, 9 years old, she was promised off to Corfitz. Different times, am I right? The couple got married in 1639, and the real it girl era began for Leo. Since her father was a queenless cuck, Leo was able to use her education in languages and culture together with her newly acquired nobility status from her husband, to act as a stand-in for the missing, queen role. When the king needed a first lady to represent the monarchy at the balls, I love balls, she was it. While Christian IV was alive, Leo and her husband were living the luxe life, sucking the money out of the state fund titty, just completely milking the state funds dry. Under the table and somewhat illegally, of course. They were buying expensive things and throwing parties, thriving. They were really in their element. But just like this waterproof eyeliner from NYX, which won't come off today but will come off tomorrow, nothing is ever permanent. So now we're in 1648. This kind of luxe lifestyle that they've been living has been going on for almost 10 years. As Christian IV's subscription to life was terminated in 1648, shit hit the fucking fan. The next king in line was supposed to be Christian's oldest son, Christian of Denmark. It's confusing, I know, but he passed unexpectedly just 8 months before his father did. So everyone was like, who the fuck is gonna be the next king? The righteous heir to the throne then was Frederick III. Frederick was a party killer who had kind of despised all this decadency that his father had allowed. In a world where monarchs are supposed to follow a strict bloodline, how could he let a bastard child act as a queen and allow Kirsten Munk to kind of toy him around like that? These pretentious nobles who do not seem to care about rules or virtues. This leads us to a side note. In 1665 was a coup. This is where it gets a little dramatic, so stay with me, gamers. Frederick III had it officially with these nobles playing around, and understandably so. Frederick was under the strictest contract with the Council of Nobles in Danish history, and in 1665 he became the last monarch to be under such a contract. Out with nobility reign, in with absolute monarchy. So, that's a side note. Go back to 1957. The prime of Leo was now over. Corfitz had lost his job, and Leo her status as First Lady. Corfitz was now under investigation for sucking a little too much on that state fund titty, and Leo's role as party hostess was forcefully overthrown by the now real queen, Sophie, who was awkward and not as educated as her, and also German. Ew. To escape the drama that arose after Daddy Chrissy IV's death, they fled to Sweden in 1657, where the notorious Queen Christina of Sweden reigned. Corfitz and Leo were broke as hell, and all they had were their intelligence on the Danish army. So, the couple saw an opportunity. Serve the Danish crown on a silver platter, and achieve hero status with the Swedish crown. Easy, right? The couple got greedy and started a double play, attempting to vow for both Sweden and Denmark at the same time, resulting in them committing the largest scale of treason in Danish history. Whoops. In 1658, after a war between Sweden and Denmark, peace negotiations began. Guess who was representing Sweden? Corfitz. Eventually, the couple were arrested in Denmark for treason and sent to the Danish version of Guantanamo, Hammershus, and there they spent 17 months before a daring prison escape that almost succeeded. Frederick felt pity because they had been abused in the prison and released them on conditions. The biggest one being, ask me for permission before leaving the fucking country. They obviously couldn't keep their promise and used their first opportunity to escape with their tail between their fucking legs. Corfitz was lucky, he was never found again. But Leo was captured in England and sent back to Denmark. There she was imprisoned in the Blue Tower prison, literally in the king's castle. 22 years later, Queen Sophie died and Leo was released. 22 years. After her release, she spent the rest of her life in a cloister in Maribo, south of Denmark. Body of work. Leo wrote 3 pieces in total about her life while she was alive. The most famous one is Memory of Pain, I know, so edgy, which used to be on the Danish curriculum if you were of a certain generation. It details her 22 years spent in the Blue Tower prison. The original manuscript for the Memory of Pain was finished in the late 1600s, but it wasn't published as a book for the hoi polloi to read until about 200 years after her death, when Sophus Birket-Smith in 1896 stumbled upon her manuscript and then subsequently transcribed it into Latin letters so that we, the common folk, could read it. Fun fact, this is a reprint from 1900, so it's like 4 years after the original. This one is somewhat accessible since it's in Danish and it's transcribed into Latin letters, but it is very old Danish and there's some German mixed in there. The second one is her French autobiography, or originally Leonora Christina Comtesse d'Ulfeldt Autobiographie 1673. I'm not going to say that number in French. The manuscript for this one wasn't found until the 1950s and was then subsequently translated and transcribed, etc. by C.O. Bøgel Andersen with scans of the original manuscript, which is a fucking goldmine. This one, as the title suggests, deals with her life in the bigger strokes, especially focusing on the time before her imprisonment in the Blue Tower prison. The third, much lesser known one is a small piece about the last years of her life after she's freed from the prison. The before-mentioned Birket-Smith got to transcribe this one too, and I have a scanning of that from the Danish Royal Archives. Furthermore, I found some small texts here and there, which I will cover in part 2. There's been plenty of literature written on her life, her books, and her relationship to her husband, Corfitz. But in the 4 years that I've spent watering this project like a basil in the windowsill, I have not been able to find a single mention of her relationship to women. Which is weird, because when I read her books, I stumbled upon some incidents that I would like to talk about now. 1. Maren, the maid. When Leo was imprisoned in the Blue Tower, she had already gained a reputation among the royal maids that if she had the opportunity to escape, she would. Queen Sophie had allegedly spun the rumor mill, coming on with all sorts of things about Leo. She was dangerous and a witch. Thus, Queen Sophie ordered that at least one maid should sleep in her bed at night. Oh no. One small problem. Due to Sophie's antics, none of the royal maids dared to do it, except one maid named Maren. This is from Memory of Pain, Leo's own words. This is my own translation. An hour after the food had been brought, in came a maid by the name of Maren, who said she, by the queen, that night, with me, had been ordered to stay. She said furthermore that the queen herself with her had spoke, and had said this: "You will be with Leonora tonight. You must not fear, she can do no evil now. If she was able to hex, she is now in prison and has no hex remedies with her. If she hits you, you are permitted to hit her back and make her bleed." Maren said furthermore, "The queen knows well that I, through a fury illness, have been disturbed. Therefore she willed that I should be with thou again. She instantly cast her arms around my neck as I sat, and caressed me in her way, and said, 'Hit me, my heart. Hit me, I shall,' she swore, 'not hit you back.' I rescued myself a little, feared that the madness would come. She said further that when she saw me come up the bridge, it was as if her heart had broken into pieces. Understood with me many words how much she fancied me." So far, you could argue that it's just Maren who's interested in Leo, but I accepted this unusual caress as the desperate times called for nothing else, smiled and said, "It should be against all righteous conventions the mind to offer who let so much affection be seen as she did, particularly when they were of her gender." And this is just where it begins. The smoking gun lies in the specific wording here. Leo acknowledges implicitly that accepting caress from another woman would be against all conventions, but to let Leo's moral purity remain intact, she must craft a disavowal narrative. I guess there is no choice but to accept the affection. When I'm imprisoned, I will never be allowed anything else. You could make the classic arguments that are also used about people in sex-segregated prisons turning to same-sex action for satisfaction, but this is only the first example I found. 2. The sex worker in Poland. We turn back the clock a little to when Leo and her husband were on the run from the Danish government. When Leo and her company landed in Danzig, what is now Gdansk in Poland, they were approached by what is implied to be a young sex worker. So, quick note about this whole trip to Danzig. It's important to note that Corfitz was not present, at all. They were traveling separately for various different reasons. It doesn't really matter. What's most important is he was not there. I would like to give a little trigger warning, since the supposed age of the sex worker is 16 or a bit more. But before we jump to conclusions, I need to stress that the word girl, P, in the 1600s of Denmark doesn't necessarily mean that she is literally a child. In my humble history student opinion, there is a slight chance that Leo has mistaken her age and simply means to call her generally young. However, in today's society, it is important to acknowledge that yes, this is problematic that a girl, possibly under 18, can be in such a situation. Lastly, pay close attention to Leo's reaction to her advances. This is from the French autobiography. A girl, 16 or a bit more, was of the conviction that Our Lady was a young lad, and fell to her neck for some caresses, which Our Lady answered as she toyed with this girl. But as Our Lady was what the girl desired, and thought that she was not created in such a way that she could please her, she handed her claim to Charles, a man of their party, in the conviction that he was better suited to satisfy her than herself. He makes a move on this little wench and offer up his servitudes, but she pushes him from her pretty hard, says her will was not for him, goes to the lady and falls on her anew. Our Lady disengaged herself from her, though not without toil, as she was a tad intrusive, and Our Lady dared not leave the chambers. So immediately you might say that this doesn't prove anything about Leo's sexuality. However, let's talk about this for a second. First of all, Leo only rejects the sex worker because she's afraid the young woman thinks she's a cis man, and she doesn't want to disappoint her. However, when it becomes clear, after the attempt to kind of scoot her over to Charles, that the girl probably knows that she isn't a cis man and doesn't care, Leo has no excuse, maybe except her possible age. So to keep Leo's innocence intact, the girl is painted as the active giver, the doer, and Leo as this victim receiving in disavowal. What's important to note about Leo's own works is that everything must be taken with a pound of salt. Her purpose with writing these works were primarily to get social redemption and pity. So if she has to come up with a disavowal in a situation where her moral purity could be stained, she will. Considering she doesn't dare to leave the chambers after this event, it's likely that she felt intimidated and wanted to avoid attracting more women to her like that. She had nothing stopping her from doing things outside the marriage, as we will see soon. It turns out her and her husband had a consensual open relationship in the 1600s. 3. Miss Elizabeth attempts to start drama by telling Leo that her man has cheated. In her autobiography, she talks of a time during the earlier years with Corfitz, where women around her would attempt to start drama, stir up the pot. One such woman was Elizabeth. For our purposes, it's not really important who she is, just that she's someone close to Leo who tries to start some shit. But she would now profess Elizabeth a secret that she may not have known, which was that she had given her man permission to spend his time with others, and when she was satisfied, the others were welcome to the leftovers. She did not think there were other jealous women than those who were insatiable. She asked her to be so wise as to not mix herself up in things that did not concern her, and if she, as Our Lady had reason to believe that it was her own invention, if she heard any others say such things, to give them a reprimand. Miss Elizabeth was peeved and walked away in great anger. This is where you start to get a feeling that Leo's views on sex are far from the traditional Christianity of the time. We might even get the feeling that her husband and her have, for the times, a more balanced relationship. She was a powerful woman, and if I can be a little non-academic for a second, Corfitz, her husband, would have probably been a femboy if he lived today. Like, this is what he dressed like. Come on. This leads us to the second smoking gun. Number 4. To keep her from her husband, Leo keeps a sex worker busy. There's been a couple of mentions in the past couple of years in Danish media about her husband, in particular that he might have had a preference for masculine and or powerful women. Keep that in mind when his sister Anne, in order to stir up the pot, attempts this little stunt. But my sire's sister Anne, who was in his house, went about it in an entire different manner. She pulls in the most beautiful ladies in the capital and would eventually act as procurer, a pimp, speaks to his brother of one in particular, who was generous with her favors, and the prettiest of them all, offer him her services, etc. When she sees that he will not take the bait, she tells him, to provoke him, that his wife is jealous, that she spies on him when he has been drinking with the king, where he goes, where he will visit this woman. She says that his wife is peeved because the other one is so beautiful, says she uses makeup, etc. The love that the man bears towards Our Lady makes him tell her everything, and he since only seldom visits his sister's chambers. From that she can understand that this conversation made him uncomfortable. But Our Lady pretends like nothing, visits her more than usual, caresses this woman more than the others, even giving her considerable presents. Anne stays as long as she lived in her house. I think I'm gonna let that quote speak for itself. I don't think there's any way I can meaningfully analyze this. I don't know how you want me to explain in a heterosexual way that this woman is well, the only way I can keep this woman from being a temptation to my husband, who isn't into feminine women anyways, is that I will keep her in work, never have any openings by me being her favorite customer. Why? That is a very heterosexual solution for that, right? Being fair and the devil's advocate here. There is a chance that she's referring to Anne when she says this woman. But considering the other examples I've presented, I think there's a pretty solid case to make that maybe Leonora Christina Ulfeldt was not 100% heterosexual. This is where I thought I was done, back when I released my incredibly under-medicated and under-researched version of this project 2 years ago. Who is this person? Where's the eyebrows? What are you doing? Cringe. But then in 2022, the historians Cecilie Nielsen and Im Påske did a podcast episode of The Queendom from the Danish national radio station about Leo's life. They mention something in passing about Corfitz' relationship to the Swedish queen Christina that raised my pink alarm bells.
How are her and Corfit's relationship? Do they get close?
Yeah, they get really close. Maybe too close? Maybe Corfitz had a thing for strong women. I don't know. But he definitely respects her a great deal, and maybe they also have a more physical relationship.
Like they fucked?
Yeah, they probably did. Hold up now just 1 second, please. Queen Christina of Sweden? The queerest queen in Swedish history? Hold my sapphire.